The clock had just struck 7 in the evening as the crowd filed into the brightly lit studio. The popular talk show Evening Spotlight was about to begin filming, and tonight's guest was someone special. The air buzzed with excitement as people settled into their seats, chatting about how they couldn't wait to see Keanu Reeves in person. "I heard he's the nicest guy in Hollywood," a woman whispered to her friend as they found their spots in the third row. "My cousin met him once at a coffee shop in New York," replied her friend. Said Keanu gave up his seat for an elderly woman and then stayed to chat with her for 15 minutes. Stories like these weren't rare when it came to Keanu. Unlike many Hollywood stars, his reputation wasn't built on scandal or drama, but on countless small acts of kindness that people shared with each other like treasured secrets. Behind the scenes, Keanu arrived at the studio 30 minutes early. He wasn't one for grand entrances or special treatment. He simply nodded politely to the security guard who showed him to the green room, thanking the man by name after reading his badge. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate your help." The guard tried to hide his surprise. In his 15 years working at the studio, few celebrities had ever bothered to look at his name tag, let alone use it. In the green room, Keanu declined most of the offered refreshments, taking only a bottle of water. He sat quietly reviewing some notes for the interview. He was there to talk about his latest film, Midnight Horizon, an action thriller that was already getting positive early reviews. A young production assistant with messy hair and tired eyes poked her head in. "Mr. Reeves? We're ready for your sound check." Keanu looked up and smiled. "Just Keanu is fine," he said, standing up and following her. As they walked down the hallway lined with photos of past celebrity guests, the assistant kept apologizing for small things: the tight schedule, the chaotic day they were having, the fact that one of the lights was flickering slightly. "No need for apologies," Keanu told her gently. "Live TV is always a bit of organized chaos. You're doing great." The young woman blushed and seemed to stand a little taller after that. Sound check went smoothly, and as Keanu was getting his microphone adjusted, he noticed the host, Richard Bell, watching him from across the set. Richard had been running Evening Spotlight for nearly a decade. He was known for his sharp wit and occasional controversial remarks that kept viewers tuning in night after night. Some called his style refreshingly honest. Others thought he sometimes crossed the line. Tonight, there was something in Richard's expression that didn't sit right with Keanu, a certain coldness in his eyes that contrasted with his wide smile. But Keanu had been in this business long enough to know that pre-show tension affected everyone differently. He simply nodded politely in Richard's direction. Richard nodded back but didn't approach for the usual pre-show chat most hosts had with their guests. The floor manager began the 10-minute warning, and the audience's chatter grew louder with anticipation. The show's theme music played through the speakers as a test, and several people in the crowd began swaying to the beat. "You nervous?" asked the makeup artist as she added some final touches to Keanu's face. "Not really," he replied. "Just hoping to have a good conversation. Richard can be unpredictable sometimes," she said carefully, keeping her voice low. "Just so you know." Before Keanu could ask what she meant, she was called away to touch up Richard's makeup. The floor manager started the 5-minute countdown, and the energy in the room shifted. Camera operators moved to their positions. Lighting technicians made final adjustments, and the audience settled down. Keanu took his place just off stage, where he would wait until after Richard's opening monologue. From there, he could see a monitor showing Richard at his desk, reviewing his note cards with a frown. The host whispered something to his producer, who shook his head firmly. Richard seemed annoyed by whatever response he'd received. 2 minutes, everyone," called the floor manager. A wave of hushed excitement swept through the audience. Phones were put away, conversations died down, and all eyes turned to the empty desk at the center of the stage. Keanu took a deep breath. He'd done hundreds of these interviews over his decades-long career. Some went better than others, but they were all part of the job, the necessary publicity that came with making movies. He wasn't particularly fond of talking about himself, but he enjoyed sharing stories about working with his talented co-stars and crew. 30 seconds. The theme music began to play for real this time, and the audience started clapping along. The lights dimmed slightly before focusing more intensely on the main stage. 10 seconds. 9-8. The floor manager continued the countdown silently with his fingers. and then pointed dramatically at Richard's entrance point. The host bounded onto the stage with his trademark energy, waving to the cheering audience. His smile was wide, his suit impeccably tailored, his presence commanding. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another exciting night on Evening Spotlight." Richard's voice boomed through the studio. "We've got a fantastic show for you tonight. Our musical guest is the incredible indie band The Broken Echoes, who just dropped their new album yesterday." The audience applauded, and later, we'll be joined by internet sensation and dog trainer extraordinaire Lisa Chen, who's going to show us some amazing tricks that might just save your furniture from your four-legged friend. More applause and a few whoops from dog lovers in the crowd. Richard's smile shifted slightly, taking on a different quality that was subtle but noticeable. "But first we have someone you all know. He's been dodging bullets in slow motion, traveling through time, and recently, taking down bad guys with nothing but a pencil." The audience erupted in cheers, many people standing up. "Please welcome the man. The myth, some might say the legend, Keanu Reeves." The applause was deafening as Keanu walked onto the stage, smiling and waving to the audience. He wore a simple black suit with no tie, his hair a bit longer than usual for his upcoming role. Richard stood to greet him with a handshake that seemed warm enough to the cameras, though Keanu noticed the host's eyes remained cool and calculating. They both sat down as the audience's cheers gradually subsided. "Keanu, Keanu, Keanu," Richard said, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "It's been, 3 years since you were last on the show?" "I think so," Keanu nodded. "It's good to be back, Richard. Thanks for having me." "Well, we couldn't let you promote your new movie anywhere else, could we?" Richard laughed. "Though I hear some of my competitors tried to lure you to their couches. I always enjoy our conversations," Keanu said diplomatically. "So, Midnight Horizon," Richard began, holding up a poster of the film. "Another action thriller. You must be getting tired of all those stunts at this point in your career." The slight emphasis on "at this point in your career" wasn't lost on Keanu, but he chose to focus on the question itself. "Not at all," he replied genuinely. "I love the physical challenge. Our stunt team is incredible, and they push me to learn new skills for each project. For this one, I trained in a specific type of Filipino martial art called Kali." "Fascinating," Richard said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "But let's back up a bit. For those who may have been living under a rock, tell us what Midnight Horizon is about." Keanu began explaining the premise of the film: a former special forces operator who becomes entangled in a government conspiracy, when he noticed Richard checking his watch. It was subtle, but some audience members noticed too, exchanging glances. "Am I boring you already, Richard?" Keanu asked good-naturedly, trying to lighten the moment. The audience laughed and a few people clapped, appreciating how Keanu had handled the awkward moment. Richard's smile tightened. "Not at all. I'm just wondering how many more stoic heroes you plan to play before trying something different. You know, something that requires a bit more range." A faint ooh rippled through the audience. This was more pointed than the usual talk show banter. Keanu took a sip of water from the mug on the desk before responding. "I'm grateful for the roles I've been offered. Each character is unique in their own way, and I try to bring something new to each one. But I'm always open to different types of projects." "Like that romantic comedy you did in the 90s? Richard asked with a smirk. "What was it called again?" The critics had some colorful names for it, as I recall. Some uncomfortable laughter came from the audience now. People were starting to realize this wasn't going to be a typical friendly interview. The producer standing off stage made a circular motion with her hand, signaling Richard to move on. "Anyway," Richard continued, "I hear you did most of your own stunts again for this film. Isn't that a bit risky for someone of your experience?" "I work with an incredible team that keeps everything as safe as possible," Keanu answered, his voice still calm and measured. "And I find that doing my own stunts whenever possible helps bring authenticity to the character." "Speaking of authentic," Richard said, leaning forward slightly, "there's been talk that this film is basically a copy of your other franchises. Some early reviews are calling it derivative. Care to comment on that?" The audience's discomfort was palpable now. This wasn't the light promotional interview they had expected. Something was off with Richard tonight, and everyone could feel it. But through it all, Keanu maintained his composure, answering each question thoughtfully, never rising to the bait. His eyes occasionally drifted to the audience, where people were watching with a mixture of confusion and growing admiration for how he was handling the situation. Little did they know, things were about to get much worse after the commercial break. The red on-air sign blinked back to life as the show returned from commercial break. The audience had spent those few minutes buzzing with whispered conversations, many expressing confusion about Richard's unusually hostile attitude. A middle-aged man in the front row had leaned over to his wife and whispered, "What's his problem tonight?" She had simply shrugged in response, equally puzzled. Back on camera, Richard adjusted his position in his chair and plastered on his television smile. Welcome back to Evening Spotlight. We're here with Keanu Reeves, star of the upcoming film Midnight Horizon. He turned to Keanu with a glint in his eye that made several crew members exchange nervous glances. So, Keanu, before the break we were talking about your new movie, but let's shift gears a bit, shall we? Your fans are always curious about your personal life. Keanu nodded politely but said nothing, already sensing where this might be headed. You've always been famously private, Richard continued. Some might even say mysterious. In fact, there's this whole internet phenomenon calling you Sad Keanu, based on photos of you looking, well, melancholy. He reached under his desk and pulled out a printed meme of Keanu sitting alone on a bench looking thoughtful. The photo had gone viral years ago. This image has been shared millions of times, Richard said, holding it up for the camera. Care to explain what was going through your mind here? Were you having a particularly rough day? A woman in the audience audibly gasped at the insensitivity of the question. Anyone who knew even a little about Keanu's life was aware of the personal tragedies he had endured over the years. Keanu took a moment before responding, his expression unreadable. I think we all have moments of reflection, he said finally. Sometimes a photographer captures one of those moments and people make their own interpretations. So you're saying you weren't actually sad? Richard pressed. I'm saying that a single photograph doesn't tell a complete story, Keanu replied calmly. We all have a full range of emotions throughout our days. Richard seemed disappointed with the measured response. Fair enough. But speaking of stories, there are quite a few about you on the internet. Some say you secretly donate millions to children's hospitals. Others claim you give away most of your earnings from big franchises to film crews. Care to confirm or deny? Keanu shifted slightly in his seat. I prefer not to discuss those things. Why not? If they're true, that's quite admirable. If they're not, don't you want to set the record straight? I believe that private actions should remain private, Keanu said. A young production assistant standing off stage was frantically signaling to the producer. This wasn't the direction the interview was supposed to take. The producer nodded in agreement and made a slicing motion across her throat, trying to get Richard's attention to change the subject. Richard either didn't see or chose to ignore her. Let's talk about your method then. Some of your co-stars have mentioned you can be quite intense on set. One director, I won't name names, suggested you were difficult to work with on a particular project. A murmur ran through the audience. This claim seemed to contradict everything people had heard about Keanu. I'm not aware of that, Keanu said, a slight furrow appearing in his brow. I try to be professional and collaborative with everyone I work with. Maybe they just didn't tell you to your face, Richard said with a shrug. Hollywood can be very two-faced that way. In the control room, the director was having a heated conversation with the executive producer. What is he doing? The director asked. This wasn't in the pre-interview. None of this was approved. The executive producer looked grim. I don't know what's gotten into him tonight. But we're live, so we have to let it play out. Back on stage, Richard was hitting his stride. Your new movie is opening against a film by Christopher Nolan. Aren't you worried about the competition? His last 3 films have been both critical and commercial successes, while your recent projects have been, well, let's just say they've had mixed reviews. A few audience members were no longer trying to hide their discomfort, exchanging shocked glances or staring at their feet. This wasn't the light entertainment they had come to see. Keanu took another sip from his mug, taking a moment to compose his thoughts. Christopher is an incredible filmmaker, and I'm a fan of his work. I don't see it as competition. There's room for different types of films, and audiences will decide what they want to see. Diplomatic answer, Richard said with a dismissive wave. Let's move on to your age. You're now in your 60s but still doing action films. Don't you think it's time to pass the torch to younger actors? I mean, there must be some parts where the stunt doubles are doing more and more of the work, right? The camera caught a brief reaction from Keanu, a slight tightening around the eyes before his expression returned to neutral. The jabs were beginning to land even if he wasn't showing it overtly. I enjoy the physical challenges of these roles, Keanu replied evenly, and I work with incredible stunt performers who help bring these films to life. It's always a collaborative effort, but surely there's a point where it becomes, what's the word, unconvincing? For a man of your age to be taking down groups of trained killers half your age, several people in the audience were now openly frowning. An older gentleman in the second row crossed his arms and shook his head in disapproval. The floor manager was making wild gestures from the side, trying to get Richard to wrap up this line of questioning. The show's social media team was already reporting a flood of negative comments coming in on the live stream. Richard glanced at the teleprompter, which was now displaying, "Move to film clip." He ignored it. "You know," he continued, leaning back in his chair, "I've always wondered about your acting range. Your critics often point out that you have the same expression in most of your roles. How do you respond to that criticism?" The tension in the studio was palpable now. A woman in the front row mouthed, "What is wrong with him?" To her friend, who looked equally bewildered, Keanu took a deep breath, and for a moment it seemed like his legendary patience might finally be wearing thin. But when he spoke, his voice remained even. "Acting is subjective," he said. "Everyone has their own interpretation of a performance. All I can do is approach each role with honesty and give it my best effort." "Honesty, right?" Richard said with a hint of sarcasm. "Speaking of which, let's address the elephant in the room. Your personal life has been marked by tragedy." Before he could finish, the producer stepped out from backstage and made a cutting motion, signaling to the director to go to the prepared clip from Midnight Horizon. The screen behind Richard and Keanu suddenly lit up with a scene from the film. The host looked momentarily confused, then annoyed as he realized he'd been overridden. Perfect timing," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed irritation. "Let's take a look at a clip from Midnight Horizon." As the clip played, showing an intense action sequence with Keanu's character narrowly escaping an explosion. The cameras weren't rolling on the main stage, but everyone in the audience could see what was happening. Richard was furiously whispering to the producer who had approached his desk, while Keanu sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. The producer's gestures became increasingly emphatic, pointing at her clipboard and then at the teleprompter. In the audience, a young woman turned to her companion. "I can't believe how rude he's being. And Keanu is just taking it with such grace. Something's definitely going on," her friend replied. "I've watched this show for years and Richard has never been this nasty." The clip came to an end, showing Keanu's character delivering a powerful line about justice before the scene faded to black. The monitor returned to the live feed and Richard's smile was back in place, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive sequence," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "How many takes did that require?" "I imagine at your age those scenes get more difficult." There was an audible groan from someone in the audience. Keanu's expression remained neutral, but a subtle change had come over him. He sat a little straighter, his eyes more focused. Those who knew him well might have recognized this as a sign that he was reaching the limits of his patience. "Film is a team effort," he said quietly. "Every scene is the result of hard work from dozens of talented people, from the director to the camera operators to the special effects team. My contribution is just one part of that. Always the humble one," Richard said. "But let's get real for a moment. Your last 3 films underperformed at the box office. Some critics have suggested you might be past your prime. Does that concern you at all when a new film is about to be released?" The producer, who had returned to her position off stage, closed her eyes in dismay. This was going completely off the rails. In the control room, the director was frantically speaking into his headset. "Go to commercial. We need to go to commercial now." But before they could cut away, something in Keanu's expression changed. The endless patience that had characterized the interview so far seemed to reach its limit. His eyes, usually warm and gentle, took on a new intensity that made Richard shift uncomfortably in his chair. The audience fell completely silent, sensing that a turning point had been reached. The tension in the studio was electric as everyone waited to see how Keanu would respond to this latest barb. And as the director counted down to the commercial break, Keanu finally began to speak. his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the hushed studio. You know, Richard, I think we need to talk about the tone of this interview. Richard, I think we need to talk about the tone of this interview. Keanu's words hung in the air. The entire studio had gone so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system. Even the camera operators, who were trained to be invisible presences on set, couldn't help but exchange glances. Richard's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. The tone? I'm just asking the questions viewers want to know. Are you? Keanu asked, his voice still soft but with a new firmness to it. Because it seems like you're trying to provoke a reaction rather than have a genuine conversation. Someone in the audience whispered, "Oh my God, it's happening," while another quietly clapped before quickly stopping when they realized no one else had joined in. The director in the control room had been about to cut to commercial, but now he held off, sensing something significant was unfolding. "Stay with this," he said into his headset. "Keep camera 2 on Keanu and camera 3 on Richard." Richard's expression hardened. That's an interesting accusation from someone who's been giving one-word answers and studio-approved talking points. "I've been responding to the questions you've asked," Keanu said calmly. "But there's a difference between a challenging interview and what you're doing tonight. And what exactly am I doing?" Richard asked, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Keanu took a moment before answering, as if carefully choosing his words. "You're attempting to use personal tragedy, industry gossip, and ageist remarks to create a viral moment at someone else's expense." A soft ooh rippled through the audience, followed by several murmurs of agreement. A young woman in the front row nodded vigorously. Richard's face flushed. "I'm a talk show host. It's my job to ask difficult questions, not just let celebrities come on and plug their latest project without any substance." "I agree completely," Keanu replied, nodding. "Substance is important. Thoughtful conversations are valuable. But there's a distinction between challenging questions and deliberately hurtful ones." The floor manager, who had been counting down to a commercial break, now stood frozen, clipboard held against his chest, watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Look," Richard said, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence, "if you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe this isn't the right venue for you." Keanu didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "This isn't about me not being able to handle tough questions. It's about basic human decency." The producer, standing just off stage, let out a small sigh of relief. Keanu wasn't storming off or getting angry. He was redirecting the conversation in a powerful but measured way. "Human decency," Richard repeated with a slight scoff. "Bit dramatic, don't you think?" "Not at all," Keanu said. "Let me ask you something, Richard. Would you ask these same questions if the cameras weren't rolling and we were just two people having a conversation?" Richard hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Or," Keanu continued, "would you ask these questions to someone who wasn't a celebrity? Someone who didn't have the protection of publicists and media training?" A man in the third row turned to his neighbor and whispered, "He's turning this around on Richard. Brilliant." In the control room, the executive producer was watching the monitors intently. "This is good television," she said quietly. "Stay with it." Richard shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable now that he was on the receiving end of pointed questions. "The context is different. You're a public figure." "I am," Keanu acknowledged with a nod. "But being a public figure doesn't mean surrendering your humanity or dignity. And more importantly, it doesn't change the impact words can have." The audience was completely captivated now, many leaning forward in their seats, not wanting to miss a single word of the exchange. "The questions I've asked are based on things that have been reported in the media," Richard said defensively. "I didn't make anything up." "That's true," Keanu conceded. "But you chose which questions to ask and how to frame them. And those choices reveal something about what kind of conversation you wanted to have tonight." Richard glanced at the teleprompter, which was no help at all since this exchange had gone completely off script. He looked briefly at the producer off stage, who simply shrugged, leaving him to navigate this unexpected situation on his own. "Look," Richard said, trying a different approach. "Viewers tune in for entertainment. They want to see something unexpected, not just the same rehearsed answers they can find in any magazine interview." "I understand that," Keanu said, And I'm all for authentic conversations. But there's a difference between unexpected and unkind. At this point, several audience members nodded in agreement, and someone even called out, "Tell him, Keanu." The producer shot a stern look in the direction of the voice, but she didn't seem too upset. The raw, unscripted moment was generating exactly the kind of authentic television that was increasingly rare in the age of carefully managed celebrity appearances. Richard's expression had become a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. His usual confidence was crumbling as he realized he had lost control of his own show. "I think you're being overly sensitive," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Keanu shook his head slightly. "This isn't about me being sensitive. It's about recognizing the power of words and choosing to use that power constructively." He paused, looking directly into camera 2 for a moment, as if speaking not just to Richard but to everyone watching at home. We all face enough challenges in life without deliberately adding to each other's burdens. Even in entertainment, even in the pursuit of ratings or clicks or views, we can choose kindness without sacrificing substance. A strange thing was happening in the studio now. Many in the audience were nodding along with Keanu's words, completely engaged in what had transformed from an awkward interview into something much more meaningful. Richard, sensing the shift in the room, attempted to regain some control. "So you're saying talk show hosts should only ask softball questions?" His tone was defensive, almost petulant. "Not at all," Keanu replied evenly. "I'm saying that there's skill in asking challenging questions while still treating your guest with respect. The best interviewers manage to do both." Richard opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. For perhaps the first time in his career, he appeared genuinely lost for words. The director, seeing an opportunity in this brief silence, spoke into his headset. "Cut to commercial in 5, 4, 3. But before they could go to break, Keanu spoke again, his voice gentle but clear. "You know, Richard, I've watched your show for years. You're capable of conducting thoughtful, insightful interviews that bring out the best in your guests. I've seen you do it many times." This unexpected kindness seemed to catch Richard off guard even more than the previous pushback. He blinked rapidly, his practiced television persona momentarily falling away to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. "Tonight feels different," Keanu continued, "and I wonder if maybe something else is going on that has nothing to do with me or this interview." The studio was absolutely silent now. Even the crew members who had been whispering among themselves stopped to listen. Richard stared at Keanu for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then something shifted in his eyes, a subtle change that suggested Keanu's words had hit closer to home than anyone might have expected. "We should go to commercial," Richard said finally, his voice slightly hoarse. "Cut to commercial," the director said immediately, and the on-air light dimmed as the show went to break. But the cameras in the studio kept rolling, capturing what happened next. As soon as they were off air, Richard slumped slightly in his chair, the performance of the last hour visibly draining from him. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. "You're right," he said quietly, so quietly that only Keanu and the nearest crew members could hear him. "It's not about you." Keanu waited patiently, giving Richard space to continue if he wanted to. After a moment, Richard spoke again, his voice still low. "My father was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer yesterday. I came straight from the hospital to the studio. I shouldn't have. I shouldn't be here tonight." Understanding dawned on Keanu's face. The hostility, the erratic behavior, it all made more sense now. "I'm sorry about your father," he said simply. Richard nodded, unable to meet Keanu's eyes. "I thought I could push through it, be professional. Obviously, I was wrong." The producer had approached the stage during this exchange and now stood awkwardly to the side, clearly unsure whether to interrupt. "We have options," she said tentatively. "We can end the show early, cite technical difficulties. Or Lisa can come on for an extended segment with the dogs." Richard looked up at her, then over at Keanu, uncertainty written across his face. Keanu glanced at the audience, who were watching this off-air conversation with rapt attention, then back at Richard. The moment hung in the balance, with no one quite sure what would happen when the commercial break ended and the cameras went live again. In the control room, the director checked his watch. 1 minute until we're back," he announced into his headset. The floor manager began the countdown. 60 seconds, everyone." And in those 60 seconds, a decision had to be made about how the remainder of the show would unfold. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife, as the final seconds of the commercial break ticked away. The floor manager continued his countdown. 30 seconds. Richard straightened his tie with unsteady hands, looking lost and unsure, a stark contrast to his usual confident demeanor. The producer stood by anxiously, waiting for someone to make a decision. 15 seconds. Keanu leaned forward in his chair. "Richard," he said quietly but firmly, "do you want to continue?" Richard looked up, surprised by the question. "I don't know if I can pull myself together," he admitted, his voice barely audible. 10 seconds. "We don't have to do this the way it was planned," Keanu said. "Maybe there's a different conversation we could have." Something flickered in Richard's eyes, a glimmer of hope, perhaps. He glanced at the producer, who gave a small nod, signaling that whatever they decided, she would support it. 5, 4, 3. The floor manager finished the countdown silently with his fingers. The on-air light glowed red once more, and the cameras went live. The audience, which had been buzzing with speculation during the break, fell silent again. Richard took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. "Welcome back to Evening Spotlight," he said, his voice steadier than might have been expected. "Before the break, Keanu and I were having a different kind of conversation than what we usually have on this show." He paused, seeming to search for words, a rare occurrence for the normally glib host. "And if it's okay with Keanu and with you, our audience, I'd like to continue that conversation, but with a bit more honesty." He turned to look at his guest. "If that's all right with you?" Keanu nodded. "I think honesty is always a good place to start," he said simply. The audience, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted and authentic, remained completely silent, all eyes fixed on the two men. Richard exhaled slowly. "I want to apologize first to Keanu and then to everyone watching for my behavior tonight. I've been unnecessarily harsh and, frankly, unprofessional." A few audience members exchanged surprised glances, while others leaned forward, drawn in by this unexpected turn. "The truth is," Richard continued, his voice growing more strained, "I received some very difficult personal news yesterday, and I made the mistake of thinking I could compartmentalize and do my job without it affecting me. Clearly I was wrong." Keanu's expression was one of quiet understanding, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. "My father was diagnosed with terminal cancer," Richard said, the words coming out with visible difficulty. "And I've been angry. At everything. At everyone." A sympathetic murmur ran through the audience. The cameraman zoomed in slightly on Richard's face, capturing the raw emotion there. "But that's no excuse for how I've treated you tonight," he added, looking at Keanu. "You didn't deserve that." There was a moment of profound silence in the studio. In the control room, the director signaled to keep both men in frame, recognizing the rare authenticity of the moment unfolding on his monitors. "I'm sorry about your father," Keanu said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly through the hushed studio. "That kind of news changes everything." Richard nodded, blinking rapidly. "It does. But what you said earlier, about choosing kindness even when things are difficult, that hit home. Because that's something my father always taught me, and tonight I wasn't honoring that at all." An older woman in the audience dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Others sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the spell of this unexpected moment of vulnerability. "I think," Keanu said thoughtfully, "that sometimes our pain comes out as anger. It's not rational, but it's human." "Very human," Richard agreed with a hollow laugh. "But not very kind. Pain rarely is," Keanu replied. There was something in his tone, a depth of understanding that went beyond simple empathy, that made both Richard and many audience members look at him with new eyes. It was well known that Keanu had faced significant personal tragedies in his life, though he rarely spoke about them publicly. Richard seemed to gather himself. "I don't want to hijack the rest of this interview with my personal problems," he said, making an effort to sound more professional. "We should talk about your film." Keanu shook his head slightly. "I think there are more important things we could discuss right now." In the front row, a young woman whispered to her friend, "Is this really happening? This is like the most real thing I've ever seen on TV." Richard hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed without his usual script.
Such as?
Well, Keanu said, his voice thoughtful. You mentioned your father. What's something important he taught you? Besides kindness, the question caught Richard off guard. He stared at Keanu for a moment, then let out a small, genuine laugh. That's not the kind of question I usually get asked. Maybe it should be, Keanu said with a gentle smile. The tension that had filled the studio earlier was transforming into something else now. A shared sense of witnessing something genuine and meaningful. Richard thought for a moment. My father is a high school teacher. English literature. He always taught me that stories matter, that how we tell our stories shapes how we understand ourselves and each other. He paused, a look of realization crossing his face. I think I've lost sight of that lately in this job. It's become more about creating moments than understanding stories. The producer, still standing off stage, looked surprised and moved by Richard's words. This was a side of him that perhaps even his colleagues hadn't seen before. That resonates with me, Keanu said. In acting, I'm always trying to find the truth in a story, even when the story itself is fiction. There's something powerful about that search for meaning. Richard nodded, seeming more present and engaged than he had been all evening. That's what drew me to journalism originally before I moved to entertainment. The search for truth in people's stories. It's never too late to return to that, Keanu suggested. A thoughtful silence fell between them. The audience remained captivated, many of them having completely forgotten that they had come to see a standard celebrity interview to promote a movie. In the control room, the director was whispering urgently with the executive producer. This is gold, the executive producer said. Pure gold. Give them more time. Push back the musical guest if we have to. Richard glanced at his notes, then pushed them aside. Can I ask you something personal? You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Keanu nodded, seeming open but watchful. You can ask. How have you dealt with loss in your life? You've faced significant tragedy, and yet you've somehow managed to remain... Richard searched for the right word. Kind. Not bitter or angry. The question hung in the air. For a moment, some audience members held their breath, wondering if this was crossing another line. But there was a different quality to the question now. Genuine curiosity rather than an attempt to provoke. Keanu was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. I don't know that I have any special wisdom about grief, he began. It's a personal journey for everyone. But I've found that pain connects us all. We all experience it in different ways, but no one escapes it entirely. He paused, looking thoughtful. When faced with loss, I think we have a choice, not about how we feel. Because those feelings come whether we want them or not, but about what we do with those feelings. We can turn inward, let the pain isolate us, or we can recognize that this suffering is part of what makes us human, what connects us to everyone else who has ever felt pain. The studio was utterly silent now. Even the cameramen were motionless, transfixed by Keanu's words. And when you see it that way, he continued, as something that connects rather than isolates, it becomes a little more bearable, not less painful but more meaningful somehow. Richard was listening with rapt attention, as was everyone else in the studio. This was no longer an interview but a genuine conversation about things that mattered. And has that perspective helped you? Richard asked softly. Keanu gave a small, slightly sad smile. On good days, yes. On bad days, I'm still working on it, like everyone else. This simple admission of ongoing struggle seemed to resonate deeply with many in the audience. An older man nodded knowingly while a woman in the second row wiped away a tear. Thank you for sharing that, Richard said, and it was clear he meant it. I think I needed to hear it today. We all need reminders sometimes, Keanu replied. About what matters. Richard nodded, then seemed to become aware again of the cameras, the audience, the fact that they were still doing a television show. We should probably talk about your film at some point, he said, with a small, self-deprecating laugh. That is why you're here. The film will find its audience, Keanu said with a shrug. This conversation seems more important right now. In the control room, the executive producer was beaming. This is why people watch television, she said to no one in particular. For real human moments like this. The floor manager held up a sign indicating they had 5 minutes left in the segment. Richard noticed it and nodded slightly. We're running out of time, he said to Keanu. But before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to share? About the film or anything else? Keanu thought for a moment, then smiled. Just that I hope people who see Midnight Horizon enjoy it. We made it with a lot of heart, but more importantly, I hope everyone watching tonight remembers what you said about your father's wisdom, that stories matter, that how we tell our stories shapes how we understand ourselves and each other. Richard smiled, a genuine smile this time, not his television persona. I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you, Keanu, for your patience, your wisdom, and your kindness tonight. As the segment came to a close and the cameras prepared to cut away to the musical guest, the audience rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. But they weren't just applauding Keanu now. They were applauding both men and the authentic, meaningful exchange they had witnessed. And as the applause washed over them, Richard and Keanu exchanged a look of mutual understanding, a look that acknowledged that sometimes the most unexpected moments can become the most meaningful ones. The final musical performance of Evening Spotlight wrapped up as the clock hit 9:45 p.m. The band took their bows to enthusiastic applause, but everyone in the studio, from the audience to the crew, knew that tonight's show would be remembered for what happened during Keanu's interview, not for the music. As the director called for the final segment, Richard returned to his desk. He looked drained, but somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Keanu had remained seated there throughout the musical performance, occasionally nodding along to the rhythm, but mostly sitting quietly, lost in his own thoughts. And we're back for our final moments on tonight's Evening Spotlight, Richard said as the cameras went live again. Keanu, thank you again for being here. It's been, well, I think we can all agree it's been an unusual show. A ripple of knowing laughter ran through the audience. Before we sign off, I want to say something. Richard continued, his tone earnest. What happened tonight wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted, and in an industry that's increasingly about manufactured moments and viral clips, I think there's something valuable about that. Keanu nodded in agreement. Some of the most meaningful moments in life are the unplanned ones, he said. Exactly, Richard replied. And I want to thank you for how you handled tonight. Many guests would have walked off set, and no one would have blamed them. Walking away isn't always the answer, Keanu said simply. Well, I'm grateful you didn't. Richard turned to address the camera directly, and to our viewers at home, thank you for being part of what turned into a very different kind of conversation than we usually have on this show. The floor manager signaled that they had 1 minute left. I don't know what the internet will say about tonight's show, Richard said with a small self-deprecating smile. But I hope that if nothing else, it reminds people that behind every public persona, there are real human beings dealing with real human struggles. And sometimes showing that vulnerability can be a strength, Keanu added. Indeed, Richard agreed. Keanu's new film Midnight Horizon opens in theaters nationwide this Friday, and based on the clip we saw earlier, it looks like it's going to be quite a ride. He extended his hand to Keanu, who took it without hesitation. Thank you, truly, Richard said quietly, though the microphone still picked it up. Take care of yourself, Keanu replied warmly. And your father. I will. The closing theme music began to play, and Richard turned to the camera one last time. That's our show for tonight. Thank you for watching Evening Spotlight. Good night. As the credits began to roll and the on-air light dimmed, the audience rose once more for a standing ovation. This wasn't the polite applause of people who had enjoyed a typical talk show. This was something more profound, an acknowledgement that they had witnessed something rare and genuine in an environment where authenticity was often sacrificed for entertainment. Backstage. 20 minutes later, Keanu was gathering his things in the green room when there was a knock at the door. It was Richard, who had changed out of his suit into more casual clothes and looked ready to leave. Do you have a minute? He asked, hovering in the doorway. Of course, Keanu replied, gesturing for him to come in. Richard closed the door behind him and took a deep breath. I wanted to apologize again properly without cameras or an audience. It's already forgotten, Keanu assured him. Not by me, Richard said, shaking his head. And probably not by the millions of people who were watching. People understand that everyone has bad days, Keanu said, especially when facing something as difficult as what you're going through. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Maybe. But what you did out there, the way you turned it around instead of making it worse, that was remarkable. You could have justified walking off set or firing back at me, and instead you chose compassion. It seemed like the right choice in the moment, Keanu said with characteristic humility. Well, it made a difference. Richard paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. My producer thinks tonight's show is going to be talked about for years. Keanu laughed softly. That wasn't exactly my goal. No, but it might be what happens. Richard ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly tired. I'm taking a leave of absence after tonight. Going to spend some time with my father while I can. I think that's a wise decision, Keanu said. No one ever regrets that kind of time. The network wasn't thrilled, but after tonight, well, they're being understanding. Richard gave a wry smile. Nothing like having a public breakdown to make your bosses more sympathetic to your personal problems. I wouldn't call it a breakdown, Keanu said. More like a breakthrough, maybe. Richard considered this, then nodded slowly. I like that perspective. A breakthrough. There was another knock at the door, and the young production assistant with the messy hair poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Reeves's car is here. Thank you, Keanu said warmly. I'll be right there. As she disappeared back into the hallway, Keanu turned to Richard once more. Take the time you need, he said. The show will be here when you're ready to come back. Richard extended his hand again, and this time when Keanu took it, he pulled him into a brief hug. Thank you, he said, his voice slightly rough with emotion, not just for being understanding about tonight, but for the reminder about what really matters. As Keanu left the building a few minutes later, he was surprised to find a small crowd had gathered outside the studio doors. Word had spread quickly about what had happened during the live taping, and now fans and curious onlookers alike were waiting, hoping to catch a glimpse of the actor whose compassionate response had transformed an uncomfortable confrontation into something meaningful. When they spotted him, a cheer went up. Keanu, always modest about such attention, gave a small wave and began making his way toward his waiting car, stopping occasionally to sign autographs or take photos with fans. A young reporter from an entertainment news outlet managed to push her way to the front of the crowd. Keanu, can we get a comment about what happened tonight on Evening Spotlight? The clips are already going viral. Keanu paused, considering his response carefully. It was just a conversation between two people, he said finally. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to each other. But Richard Bell was incredibly rude to you, the reporter pressed. Many celebrities would have walked off. Why didn't you? Everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about, Keanu said simply. Responding to anger with more anger rarely solves anything. As he continued toward his car, an older man stepped forward, hand outstretched. Keanu shook it automatically. I just wanted to say thank you, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. My wife and I were in the audience tonight. We lost our daughter last year, and what you said about grief, about it connecting us rather than isolating us, that's the first thing that's made sense to me in a long time. Keanu's expression softened. I'm sorry about your daughter, he said quietly, echoing the same words he had said to Richard earlier, but with the same genuine compassion. Your words helped, the man replied simply, and I wanted you to know that. By the time Keanu finally reached his car, the video clips from the show were already spreading across social media platforms. Hashtags like Keanu Wisdom and Get Real Moments on TV were trending, with viewers sharing their reactions to the unexpected vulnerability and authenticity they had witnessed. The morning shows would dissect the interview frame by frame. Cultural critics would write think pieces about the power of genuine human connection in an increasingly artificial media landscape. Richard's heartfelt apology and Keanu's compassionate response would be analyzed from every angle. But as Keanu's driver pulled away from the studio, he wasn't thinking about any of that. His mind was on the older man who had lost his daughter, on Richard and his ailing father, on the universal experiences of loss and grief that connect us all, even when we feel most alone. His phone buzzed with a text message from his agent. Clips from tonight are everywhere. Your publicist is getting calls from major outlets wanting interviews about what happened. How do you want to handle this? Keanu thought for a moment, then typed a simple reply. Let's not over-explain it. Some things speak for themselves. He put his phone away and looked out the window at the city lights gliding by. In an industry built on carefully crafted images and strategic public moments, tonight had been something different, something real. And maybe he thought that was enough. 3 weeks later, Richard Bell returned to host Evening Spotlight after spending precious time with his father. In his opening monologue, he spoke candidly about how the now famous interview with Keanu had changed his approach to his work and his life. The authenticity that had emerged from that unscripted moment had reminded him why he wanted to be a broadcaster in the first place. Not to create viral moments or generate controversy, but to have meaningful conversations that might, in some small way, help people feel less alone in their experiences. And halfway across the country, where Midnight Horizon was breaking box office records, Keanu Reeves was being approached by fans who wanted to talk not just about the movie's spectacular action sequences, but about grief and kindness and the courage it takes to choose compassion even in difficult moments. It wasn't what anyone had expected from a routine talk show appearance to promote an action film. But sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we never plan to tell.